Hi, we move into Genesis 15 today in a strange story of Abram experiencing a deep darkness and birds of prey coming down upon him as he sits between animals he's cut in half, waiting for Yahweh to respond to the question of how long until he'll get a child in fulfillment of the promise that was made back in chapter 12. So as we begin this chapter, a number of issues, including the ones that we've been seeing that scholars tend to jump to, as where was this story from, and are there different sources, and how did it get put together. Again, we're not going to focus on that a lot, but we have to look at it a little bit because there are certainly elements of it that raise those questions, including what seems to be an out of order sequence of day and night, and some other elements that lead scholars to have some questions about where this text came from. But but as we do that, I'm going to note that other scholars, as we've been seeing with chapter 14, have shown how tightly integrated the form of it we have now is, both with itself, the so-called two scenes in 15:1 to 6 and then 7 to 21, but also chapter 15 in connection with chapter 14 that we just looked at and chapter 13 before it. So as we've seen last time, I showed you the set of links between chapter 14 and 15, and we're going to look at some of those as we go. But David Zucker, who's done a lot of this kind of work, has shown even more, and I won't go through his details, but he's shown how there are a number of examples of key words that are either 7 times in chapter 13 and 14 and also 7 times in chapter 15, or 7 times across some of those to show how tightly the final editors at least have tied all this together. So I'm not going to worry about all that here. We're just going to let that be as we go, and we're going to look at our story in light of some other aspects of what holds it together. So here we're looking at this element here, this third of the invitations and promises, and here the invitation is about descendants. The invitation here in this chapter will also include land, but there will not be something for Abram to do in response to that as there is here. As I was just noting on two scenes, Gordon Wenham here highlights the pairing across the two scenes, so 15:1 to 6, and we can see them color-coded here. So first, the red part is what God is offering here, Yahweh in both cases offering just in general a reward in the first part and this land to possess. Then Abram questions with a but in the English translation here. First, who would be the heir? And second, how will he know that he's to possess the land? And then in the green, the word of Yahweh comes and responds. And in the second part, it's to engage in this complex sacrifice. And then we see the purple part, which is what Yahweh does to Abram to set up what follows. So either brings him outside in the first part or sends a deep sleep and a deep and terrifying darkness upon him. And then Yahweh speaks in the first part about counting the stars, and the second part about a future where his descendants would be enslaved for 400 years in a foreign land. And of course, that's a reference to the Exodus story that we'll be looking at. And then finally, there's a response and a promise at the end. So we'll see these two sets of the story are linked very closely together, but they're also linked backward and forward, at least in terms of the way the Bible is ordered, the way we have it, with Exodus and with the David story. So looking back at the Exodus, and I won't go over through all of these, we'll look at more of them as we go, but this is very tightly connected to the Exodus story. And I noticed the Exodus story, not just the book of Exodus, but the Exodus story as it finds itself in Deuteronomy and also in Psalms, especially Psalm 105 and 106. And we'll see a number of those elements here. And you can see right from the start, both in terms of keywords and also in terms of themes. So in the end, it's not exactly keywords here, but the sense of coming out with great possessions and then coming out of Egypt with great possessions. And then the smoking pot and flaming torch matching the appearance of Yahweh, the Epiphany on Mount Sinai with smoke and lightning there. So we'll be looking at how this is both anticipating the future of the story world, but of course the past of the audience's world, if we're assuming they're in exile when Exodus was a distant memory. And then also of memory is of the monarchy of David. If this is from exile, then the Davidic monarchy is gone, and that raises the question of the covenant in 2 Samuel 7 that a descendant of David would be on the throne forever. And so using the work here from Bernard Goss, an article appropriately called Abraham and David from 2009, he draws some connections here that I want to look at as we start, and we'll see more of this as we go. So Here's this sense at first that in the post-monarchical time, some biblical authors at least substituted the patriarchs as the symbol of hope for Yahweh's relationship with Israel in the future rather than the monarchy. Not all, as I've been noting a number of times, both in this series and the series on Samuel, the Hebrew Bible is an argument or conversation among varying viewpoints. And so in different times there are pro-monarchical and anti-monarchical and pro-alliances with other nations and anti-alliances with other nations. So Genesis here is one of those that's highlighting what the psalm is doing here, which is making the patriarchs in memory a substitute for the monarchy, that the covenant for the future of the audience of Genesis would be based on the promises to Abraham and Sarah and the others, as we're seeing, rather than on the promise to David. And yet there's also a looking forward to David in a certain way, like David is something that will come out of Genesis, given that Genesis's narrative world is much earlier than the monarchy, even if it might likely have been written later, or at least part of it written later than part of the David story, and we know how all that goes. But let's just look at the substance of this, of what we can, and not worry about the parts that scholars still argue with. So we see in Psalm 89 a remembrance of the covenant with David. I've made a covenant with my chosen one. I've sworn to my servant David. But a few verses down later in the psalm, you have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. And so we see in another Psalm 105, O offspring of his servant David, children of Jacob, his chosen ones. Notice the chosen one first is the Messiah, David, versus his chosen ones, the Israelites. Mindful of covenant forever, and notice the forever parallel here as well. The covenant made with Abraham, not the covenant with David, which is confirmed to Jacob's statute as an everlasting covenant. So the psalm here is making what we're seeing in our story in Genesis 15 all the way through 17. Many scholars noting this is really all one covenant set here as a substitute for the Davidic covenant. And then we can see a number of elements where the parallels between David's actions and Abram's are noted here. But as I noted last time in looking at chapter 14, one of the elements that's parallel is that Abram acts like a warrior, like David, but he's not supposed to be a warrior. David is a warrior, and that's what gives him status amongst the crowd. And we saw early on in the David story, the people in the street shouting, Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So celebrating his military might, and that gets him women, and it also gets him royal authority. But Abraham is not a career soldier, and he only did this to rescue Lot. And so at the end of it, he refuses to be rewarded by the king of Sodom for it. And as we're going to see, Yahweh and the text provide an alternative means of dealing with land and property. So when we see Abram in this case, acting like David, it's ironically a criticism of what is in the future of the biblical story, but in the past of the audience. And so we see that down to the end here, that in 2 Samuel, this was the promise of someone on the throne that was of the house of David. And here we're going to see the parallel, someone from the house of Abram, who's not on any throne, but is the inheritance of the promises. One last thing about that before we begin to look at the text, and this isn't from other scholars, this is really just a little of my own work here, which is there's a certain parallel here between how chapter 14 goes and the beginning of chapter 15 to what we saw earlier with the Tower of Babel story in the first call of Abram. So as we looked at the Tower of Babel story back in chapter 11, as most scholars would say, it's a satire or a parody of the human building project. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the whole face of the earth. And of course, they are scattered, and the only name they make for themselves is foolish, or Babel there, as we see at the end of the story. But immediately after that story, in the next chapter, there's a little genealogy that takes place in between in chapter 11. But in the beginning of the next chapter, Yahweh calls Abram to go from your country and your kindred, and that country is the very place that the tower was being built, and Yahweh will make your name great. So we saw that contrast there with whether people's names are made great by their own building projects apart from God, or whether their names are being made great by listening and obeying God. And listening, obeying in Hebrew are the same thing. And so we see in our chapter a parallel with that. In chapter 14 was the question of control of land and property. And Abram chose the way of empire, the way of the military, the way of kings, of gathering soldiers and leading them in a violent assault and chasing them violently out of the land. And immediately after that, this is much more immediate than after the Tower of Babel. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram and said, I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur the Chaldeans. In other words, it's not human strength. It's not battling with other kings. It's not taking up the way of empire to do it. It's the alternative of listening to Yahweh, who gives you the land, not a land that you take. Notice the emphasis on taking in here and routing. So not on taking, but on giving. And so whether it's about making one's name great or about how one gets possession of the land and property, the question is, does one do it by violence and force, or does one do it by listening to the Creator and responding to that? And so we can see many parallels here between this and that. So let's put our scene back up here as we begin to look at more details of this. So after these things, a sharp stop here. It's the first time we're seeing this here, and it's common in the Bible, but it's the first time we're seeing it in the Abram story to make a clear distinction, even though there is continuity. And the phrase "the word of the Lord" is first here. It's very common in the prophets, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel, which suggests to many commentators that this is a late text, although it doesn't have to be necessarily, and it doesn't have to be late. It can be from the time of exile that we're claiming, because that's when Jeremiah and Ezekiel were writing as well. So it's twice here. It's in this verse, and then we see it again in verse 4. So the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. And this is the first time we're seeing this here. B'machazeh here. It's only one other time. It's in Numbers and then in Ezekiel as a trance. And so other than just hearing, this is the first time we're getting some sense of a specific way by which Yahweh is communicating with Abram. And out of this visionary state, Abram hears, do not be afraid. 78 times in the Hebrew scriptures, first here, and you can see it's a number of times in Genesis. And so what would he have to be afraid of at this point? Sarna suggests in my note below is a fear of revenge from the defeated kings, but that seems so unlikely to me, given that Abram and his 318 trained men seem to take on armies of uncounted multitudes and chase them all the way up to the north of Damascus. So it's hard to imagine why he would be immediately afraid now. The fear perhaps is just the fear of having been overcome in a vision and the mystical element of that, but it's not clear exactly what. But do not be afraid, I am your shield. And that's connecting back to what we saw earlier about shield, back to 14:20 there, so highlighting the point that it's Yahweh, not military might, it's the shield. And your reward shall be great. Notice the parallel with your name shall be great in chapter 12. And as my note here below says, sometimes suggests economic settlement may be rendered wage, but this usage implies gift and not quid pro quo. Here the reward is not a prize that is earned, but a special recognition given to a faithful servant of the king who has performed a bold or risky service. That from Walter Brueggemann. And of course, notice that contrasts with what Abram refused to take from the king of Sodom just a few verses earlier. So the reward from God rather than the reward from the king of Sodom. But Abram said here, and we see that there are many issues in the translation here. So this translation is difficult, and all are difficult because there are many Hebrew words here and the structure of it that are difficult. But we'll do the best we can with what we have here. So Abram said, and this is the first time that Abram is speaking to Yahweh, as surprising as it may seem the first time. And I like this quote from Sarna that expresses something of Abram's imagined, at least, emotional state here. In unquestioning obedience to the divine command, he had broken his ties with his family and become a wanderer in a strange land. His life has been repeatedly in danger. The years had rolled by, and the promises of progeny had not materialized. Through it all, Abram maintained his silence. Now the measure of recurring disappointment and prolonged frustration has reached its limit. The bonds of restraint are broken, and the patriarch bears the bitterness of his soul in a brief, poignant outburst bordering on utter despair. And this is what we hear. O Lord Yahweh, here, a rare occasion, Adonai Yahweh. It's the first time in Genesis, but 420 times that Adonai, the Hebrew word for Lord, much like Kyrie in Greek or Señor in Spanish, can apply to God or humans, and becomes a generic word instead of Yahweh among pious Jews throughout the centuries, to say Adonai rather than to say Yahweh. So, O Lord Yahweh here, what will you give me? Give is a key word here 5 times in this one of several key words. Will you give me, for I continue childless. Holic is the word here, which is to say this has been going on a long time. The word for childless is only 2 other times, and as divine judgment. So it implies, as the childless women often experience too, that there's some kind of divine punishment going on. And yet Abram has received these promises. So that's where the confusion is. If he's been obedient and he's been given these promises, why isn't the promise being fulfilled? But then he goes on and offers something that's, again, difficult to translate, both in terms of Hebrew and in terms of the story's plot. The heir of my house, which is a difficult translation here. Uven Meshech. Meshech is only here in the Hebrew scripture. And it's a wordplay on Damascus, which is Damasek here. And you can see the transliterations are similar. But literally, it's the son of Meshech, which leads some people to read this not as the heir of my house, but as the son of Masech, my steward. This is Damascus Eleazar. That's when I'm taking it from the Septuagint. But there are many, many other guesses here. And the heir of my house would suggest not a bodily son of Abram, but somebody who was adopted, much like the text will suggest that Yahweh is adopting Abram. So Eleazar, as we noted in the last video, has in Hebrew the numerical value of 318, matching the number of men that he used on his chasing off the kings of Sodom and the others here, or the ones that were against the king of Sodom. And then Damascus here is only in the previous story and nowhere else in the Pentateuch. And again, my note here below has a number of possibilities for how to render this. One as the adopted son, but there's no specific evidence. And as from Damascus is contrary to biblical Hebrew usage, which would be Eleazar Mede Damasek. So it's very confusing there, and we just will leave it as it is because we just can't get any closer to knowing what that might mean. So Abram says that, and notice how the narrator, the writer adds, and Abram said again. Wenham says widely regarded as a gloss explaining the obscurities of the previous one, and that may be the case, but it's also, as we've seen before, the narrator, the writer, adds an extra and so said to highlight that these are not necessarily sequential statements, that these are things that are being said amidst a wider conversation over a longer period of time. So having asked the question, what will you give me? Now the response is, you have given me no offspring. And there's a number of words we have to look at. Here for offspring is zara, literally the word for seed, for human seed or plant seed or etc. Different than the word for heir here is son, and different than the word for heir here, yorish, which is actually the participle inheriting, who is to be inheriting. So a number of different words here about something flowing out of something else, and we'll see even more of that in the next verse. And so you've given me no seed, and look, Behenna, it's almost always untranslated by the Hebrew, by the New RSV, and Behenna, a slave born in my house, literally the son of the house. And we could look through a number of historical questions about what that might mean, about the relationship between Eleazar and Abram, but it's again mostly speculation. It may mean that he was adopted, and he may end up being the character we meet again in chapter 24, but that character is not named, and so we simply don't know. So a slave born in my house to be inheriting, and notice the issue is on inheriting here, not on love, and there's no mention of Sarai, no mention of the joy of offspring, simply the question of inheritance. And as many scholars have noted, in the story world, that doesn't make a lot of sense. There's no legal situation and no need for an heir if they're wandering nomads. That makes sense for the audience when they have a legal system where property is organized around royal laws, etc. And so now the word of the Lord comes to him again. And again, the narrator has a Behenna. So Abraham had a Behenna, and now the narrator has a Behenna. This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. And the phrase for issue literally is what springs from your loins. Me'amim here, and we'll see that again. And it makes a word play with the next verse. So let's look at that here. So in other words, what comes out of you, and he brought him out. So when referring to what will come out of Abram, which is obviously not the child, but the seed, will come out of Sarah. At that point, she'll be Sarah. And then he brings him outside as a symbol of that. And we'll see throughout, the outside suggests that are in a tent, and tents are almost always womb symbols. And we'll see more of that in the very next chapter, in 16, and also in chapter 18. So he brought him out. Another one of the key words on this chapter, outside. Um, as my note has no previous indication of the locale, but as the Midrash suggests, three kinds of bringing out which God does for Abraham: out of Ur, out of the tent to see the stars, and the sperm out of his body. A relatively rare word. He says, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars," an image we also see in 2nd Isaiah there, "if you are able to count them." And this is one of the places where scholars wonder about the chronology, because this seems to be nighttime, except it's in a vision. And so since he's having a vision, we don't have to worry about whether it's day or night or the literalness of this. This could all be dream material here that Abram's experiencing. And the scholars who worry about the literal chronology tend to put that aside. So he shows him the uncountable multitude of the stars, and so shall your descendants be. And we get to the key verse here, which we could spend weeks on, and I'm not going to, because this video has gone on very long already. But I'll just say a couple of things that will set that up. Everything about the translation is questionable. Everything about the Lutheran version is questionable. And everything about the Paul version behind the Lutheran version, or maybe in front of the Lutheran version, given recent scholarship on Paul hundreds of years after Luther, is questionable. And let's just look at that briefly here. This is not a series on Romans and Galatians or on faith versus works, but we at least need to understand the verse a little bit here. And so this will begin the second scene. He believed or trusted. Notice the word there with no vowel is similar to amen. So be it. So let something be. It's the first of 52 uses of the verb in the hifel in the Hebrew scripture, but it's only one other time in Genesis. It's used positively in Exodus, and that was in the links that I showed here. Back up here with the people trusted, and yet there's only one Yahweh in the verse. He trusted Yahweh and he reckoned it to him as righteous, and that leads to three possibilities. Abram reckoned that God was righteous. God reckoned that Abram was righteous. So the Pauline view, and of course the Lutheran view, are dependent upon reading this as Yahweh is crediting something to Abram. But it's almost certainly that's not the natural reading of the passage. And it can easily be read the other way, as it was in the book of Jubilees, written before the New Testament era, where it was assumed that this is attributing righteousness to Yahweh. The word for reckoned here, here in the qual imperfect, can also be translated as planned, and that's what Wang, in his article about this, suggests, that this is eschatological, that this is about the future, that Yahweh planned righteousness for Abram, and that's fulfilled in chapter 22. In other words, already Yahweh knows what Abraham will do in chapter 22 in the binding of Isaac, and is counting that forward now. And so that's one way to read this. Another way is to suggest, even if we read this as counting, as a calculation, that it's not opposed to works, that it implies that the trust that Abram has is a trust built on the commandments. And even though the commandments have not been issued yet, in the sense that Genesis comes before the books of the Torah that they're illustrated in, I've showed a number of places here where Leviticus is plainly in the background. And Hebrew Bible readers, as opposed to modern scholars, although they're coming around to that, often read the entire Bible as simultaneous rather than chronological sequenced. And so the idea that Abram doesn't know the commandments yet because Moses hasn't come into the story yet is a moot point, that the commandments are written on the heart, that whether Abraham knows Leviticus or not isn't the question. It's whether Abram knows the will of Yahweh and is living it. And so it's not a matter of faith alone, the way Luther is trying to express it in his argument with the Catholic Church of his era, but rather with what trust in God is here, which is obedience to what God is calling for. And if you want to know more about that, I can recommend several 1,000 plus pages books on Romans, etc. on that. So we'll stop there, and next time we'll pick up with the response where Yahweh offers an amazing promise to Abraham of great land. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.